Anarik Mustmar cleared her throat and rapped her baton on the music stand in front of her. The sharp sound echoed through the silent auditorium. Her orchestra stared at her, unspeaking, unblinking, their instruments gripped tight and ready. "Let's try this from the top," she said. She raised both hands in the air, baton grasped between thumb and forefinger, and took a deep breath in. She waited for a moment, holding the air in her lungs, then flicked her wrist as she let the breath escape. With perfect precision, the musicians followed the beat of her hands, wading into the opening bars of tonight's principal piece. Anarik let her hands weave and bob in front of her, feeling the music ebb and flow through the air. Gently, she choreographed the dancing melody, gesturing to the vibrano players so that the sound of their instruments swelled, while she waved at the melodiums to soften their song. But as she went, something irritated her ear. Somewhere in that ballet of music, one instrument was just a half step behind, each bar beginning a semi-quaver too late. Her hands kept moving, but she closed her eyes and furrowed her brow, listening hard to identify the tardy player. "Valens!" Anarik's shout reverberated around the room, cutting through the music. She let her hands fall to the music stand, and all playing stopped. "You're dragging, Valens. You need to keep up." Anarik looked to Turbra Safmin, the only Valens player in the orchestra. He stared back at her, his face slack, his eyes vacant. Anarik sighed. "Let's pick back up from bar 16 and keep up this time." Once more, Anarik's baton cut through the air and the music filled the space around her. But as the orchestra approached the first coda, she heard it again. The gentle tune of a Valens coming in too late on each bar. "Stop!" she cried, and her baton dropped to the floor. The orchestra watched silently as she stepped down from her podium and made her way through their ranks to approach Turbra. "What is it?" she asked. He stared ahead of him and didn't answer. With an exasperated grunt, Anarik squatted down on the balls of her heels and opened the access panel in his chest. Within the Valen player's chassis, lights blinked and servos whirred. Anarik sucked her teeth and looked around for what could be causing the issue. After a couple of minutes searching, she found it. A capacitor on one of his PCBs had burnt out, the green plastic marred by dark brown scorch marks. She'd have to find a replacement board. She got back on her feet, her hands on her hips, and announced to the orchestra, "Everyone take 5 while I fix this." The players all remained in their seats as Anarik climbed out of the orchestra pit and found her envirosuit. They maintained their stony silence as she wrestled the suit on, clamping the helmet into place. Once dressed, Anarik moved to the auditorium door and braced herself as she thumbed the access panel. The pneumatic hiss of the opening door was almost immediately drowned out by the roar of vacuum. Anarik could feel the void of space pulling at the material of her suit, but the mag-lock boots prevented her from being pulled off the ship. Once the pressure had equalized and the roaring stopped, she stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind her, and she was left in shadowy silence. The damage the interstellar cruise liner had sustained left all systems inoperative in most areas. Anarik was thankful the power still worked in the auditorium. Out here in the hallway, she could barely see where she was going. The only light came through a hole blown in the ship's hull, A turbo laser blast had torn through 3 decks, narrowly missing her auditorium, and transforming one wall of the hallway into a yawning chasm into space. She briefly looked out the hole, at the twinkling lights of far-off star systems, but pulled herself away and trudged further into the darkness. She had an idea where she could find some droids to salvage parts. After passing through several broken doors and stepping over the bodies of 2 security guards and 1 stormtrooper, she found the place she was looking for. A door with an Arabesh sign above that identified it as maintenance only. It was open, with no power to have closed it after she was last here. Inside, she could make out a workbench with a deconstructed droid sitting on top of it. Anaric reached up and turned on a flashlight at the top of her suit's helmet and began searching. Around the workbench were bins filled with replacement parts for the droids that had served the cruise liner before it was attacked. Not knowing where best to start, she began digging through a bin of PCBs, looking for one that might fit. As she searched, Anaric glanced around, looking for some clue to where she might find the right board. As she looked over to the left corner of the room, she froze. The pool of light from her helmet had fallen on a face, or what remained of one. A head, stripped of its skin, was staring up at her. With no lips to cover them, its teeth spread out in a ghoulish grin. Its eyes, with no lids to blink, were bulging from their sockets, the negative pressure of space almost pulling them out completely. Anaric knelt down, angling her light past the dry, skinned muscle where a face should have been, to look at the clothes the corpse was dressed in. It was a woman, the desiccated body draped in a sparkling green dress. Anaric recognized it as Ibrella Corley, first melodium in the orchestra. Anaric had forgotten she'd found her here. Poor Ibrella must have hidden in this room when the ship was attacked, and died when the hull lost integrity, exposing most of the ship to vacuum. Memories tried to push their way into Anaric's mind. How it had felt, sliding a vibroblade under the skin around Ibrella's jaw. How the muscle of her face had glistened, slippery and wet, when Anaric peeled her face off of her skull. And times before that, laughing with Ibrella on the observation deck after a performance. The whole orchestra raising glasses together to celebrate another successful tour around the stars. And now, a series of droids sat in an empty auditorium on a cruise liner with no passengers, each one wearing the face of one of her colleagues. How had things changed so much? Why had they? Why had Anaric done this? She shook her head violently, slapping the helmet of her suit to make the memories flee. She couldn't be distracted now. She had to find the board. Turbra Safmin needed repairs. The show had to go on.